Last time we were taking a look at the rise of the Russian Revolution. Mainly what we're studying this week is a case study of nationalism and how we see art and propaganda emerging from this. And I wanted to give you some contextual information that provides an overview of what's happening in Russia as we take a look at their emerging art of this new type of nation. We talked about last time some of the elements that were leading up to the Russian Revolution. And I wanted to examine some of the symbols that come from the Soviet Union with the rise of communism. This becomes the new symbol of Russia, or the Soviet Union, as it's going to later be known as. This is the hammer and the sickle. And what this represents is the coming together of industry and the agrarian world. And so what we see is that Russia is going to be built upon these two founding principles, that the working class, the farmers and the laborers and industry are going to be the very bedrock of this new communist system, focusing more on the little man rather than the industrialist, where in the West, particularly in the United States, they tend to focus on those that have a lot of money, those that have a lot of wealth, the industrialists, and we say that these are our heroes because they have this idea of class mobility, the American or the bourgeoisie dream. The focus is going to be on, those who can rise above their circumstances and aspire from, obscurity and poverty to wealth and prominence. And we see different values that are emerging from this. And this is part of what we were talking about in week two with with ideology and the different economic systems. The different economic system is going to affect the superstructure, the where the values are, the laws, the ideas, the social norms start to emerge, and we start to see that in the Soviet Union with a different economic system. We see a rise of new ideas that are beginning to take root, and this particular image here, the worker and the collective farmer, is a good representation of these new images, what the values that the Soviet Union is going to be focusing on. We again see the symbol of the hammer and the sickle, but it's also a representation of manhood and womanhood and coming together collectively, working in unity and harmony to better the entire nation. And so this becomes kind of the foundational element of Russian art. But again, we've been taking a look at the differences between art and propaganda. And those, boundaries become a little bit obscure, right? We're not really sure. I mean, in some ways, this is definitely art. You see that the sculpture here, you see it from different angles. But the message is a very kind of political message with the emergence of this new society, this new form of economic and political system of communism. And so it's kind of interesting where one ends and where one begins becomes a little bit more obscure. And we've talked a little bit about some of those some of the differences that we can think about as we go forward. But something I want you to consider today as we take a look at the art coming out of the Soviet Union is it really art or is it propaganda? And part of that is going to get us to think more, kind of consider our own art that surrounds us, whether that is more art or propaganda. Because as we see things that are different from us, we can tend to say, okay, I can see that, I can see through it, and I can see it as propaganda. But when we see things that we generally just accept, then we just tend to see it differently. And so this is a good case study, taking a look at the Soviet Union and the development of communism and communist art is a good way to get us to reflect on our own world. And so this is a good case study within that. I want to take a look at Malevich and his airplane flying, and he's going to be one of the major artists for Lenin's art. And so this is going to be early kind of Russian art that's going to emerge with the rise of the Russian Revolution in 1917. So this one's a little bit early, but they're going to use this form of art to promote communist initiatives, communist ideas, and it's known as suprematus. That's going to be the art movement. That's going to be the first real movement that happens with the communist takeover in Russia. And what we see here is that he calls this, or the suprematists suggest that there are four different values. A new realism, which is abstraction. And the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, take hold of that idea within art because they believe that something that's concrete, something that's visual, is a representation of ideology. And what they're trying to do is to remove ideology. And so they're trying to create something very similar to what German expressionists are trying to do in Germany, something that's more emotional, more emotion based rather than rational based, right? Rationality has a form of corruption, has a form of, tradition that's kind of involved with it. And so if we can move away from tradition, we can move away from the ideas of the past that they perceive as corrupted, then they get to more of a pure form of art, and they can get to then kind of connecting this to communism, a pure form of human society, right? And so the focus is on abstraction because that's focusing more on emotions and the corruptions of human thought. And so the focus is on line, color, brush strokes, and the purity of shapes. And so they're going to see very simple shapes, as we see here, with squares and rectangles and very simple colors, right? Red, yellow, and black and blue, and that's pretty much it. And so the whole idea of this is to just to reflect more emotions rather than focusing on something that's actually visually referenced. And with this one, with the airplane flying, the question might be, so where's the airplane? And I don't really know. Perhaps this is a shot from above at the city below. Maybe these are the buildings of the city. I don't really know what that is. But it's an emphasis on, just trying to get people to feel rather and to experience rather than to think, which can be manipulated. And so that's kind of the suprematist mindset. Displaying that pure feeling in art and this utopian ideal of trying to find purity of ideas rather than the corruption of ideas. And they also tend to focus on humanity's supremacy over nature, and so that the focus here is on the flying airplane, the use of technology, the use of invention, and so we're going to see that also taking root within the Russian art, particularly Stalinist art. This is Malevich, who's the artist, and here's a quote from him that gets us to think about maybe what's happening. Maybe this can provide a little bit more insight into his objectives with his art. He says, I transform myself into the zero of form. All right, so trying to remove tradition, the traditional form of art. He says, I destroyed the ring of the horizon and escaped from the circle of things, from the horizon ring that confines the artist and the forms of nature. And so it's an idea of kind of freeing the artist from the shackles of representational art. And so just trying to focus more on something different, something new, something a new way to see the world. And that new way of seeing the world can then open our minds because we're no longer bound by the past. Here we see some, use of, communist influence within the art to beat the whites with the red wedge. The whites we've talked about in the previous lecture were the ruling party because Nicholas II abdicated his throne. He wanted nothing to do with. He kind of saw the writing on the wall and didn't want to be the king or the czar of Russia anymore. And so the whites then took over. And here we see the red wedge, which is a representation of communism beating the whites. And so it's a celebration of communist ideas, communist principles, the idea of collectivity as being part of the art world. And so it starts to blur that line a little bit. Is this a political message that's driving, being driven by politics, or is this an individual artistic message that's just trying to represent the artist's individual thought and individual expression? And so we'll have to kind of keep that in the back of our minds as we move forward. But this becomes, the avant-garde and propaganda for this new Russia that's emerging, right? More of an abstract kind of vision in order to get people to kind of think a little bit more critically about their past, about their traditions, and to consider new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things, which is exactly what the communists are seeking to do as they're reforming the society and creating something quite new and different that hasn't really taken shape in Russia. So we see the symbolic use of shapes, the abstract, non-objective art. Typical palette of red, black, white, and gray. Again, these are kind of some of the symbols of communism, but it's also the symbol of simplicity, a symbol of kind of purity. And the defeat of the whites is represented here. I wanted to take a look at the cult of Lenin that Stalin starts to create. After Lenin suffered a series of strokes. He died, and Stalin took over. And Stalin's kind of an interesting figure because as Lenin came to the fore and became the leader of Russia, Stalin was kind of a distant figure, sort of. I mean, mainly it was Lenin and Trotsky that were the ones that were the kind of the driving force within this Russian Revolution. And Stalin was mainly just the muscle. He didn't really have, I mean, Lenin never really took him seriously, never really thought he had any ideas. But when Lenin dies, Trotsky flees the country, and I believe he ends up in Mexico. And Stalin then is the one that's left to take charge. And I wanted to take a look at what he does as a result of this. One of the things that he does is creates a mausoleum for Lenin. And what they did is they embalm Lenin's body, put him kind of encased in this glass tomb for people to go into. And so here's the outside of the mausoleum, and then inside you have the body of Lenin, which they've preserved. And then people can go in and then pay their respects. And so I want you to think about some of the critical questions to consider with this is why would Stalin spend so much time trying to create this quote unquote cult of Lenin, right? And because for the most part, they really didn't see eye to eye. They were mainly, I guess, in some ways, competitors or adversaries to some extent, right? They kind of had the same basic principles and ideas, but definitely different approaches. And so one of the other things that Stalin implements is this little pin here, where it's just kind of reflecting the representation. I mean, as this is Lenin as a little boy, and they would give this pin to school children to go to wear as they go to school. And so, kind of interesting that it has this kind of religious iconography. It's almost like he's connecting Lenin to baby Jesus, and then kind of promoting that as an idea. And so here we see kind of more of a propagandistic approach to art. But again, the critical question is why would he do that, right? What's he trying to do as he promotes this person who's gone? I mean, it seems to make sense that if he didn't really agree with Lenin, that he could just say, oh, you know what, this guy was, terrible, and let's not focus on him. Let's do something different. I'm a man of change and doing things in a completely different way, which is going to change a lot of what Lenin does. But instead, he kind of leans into Lenin and starts promoting some interesting ideas. And here's the Lenin in rostrum. So this is Lenin speaking to a crowd of people surrounded by, the red here, the red flag of communism that's flying here in this banner. And then we have this stately individual, Lenin just kind of teaching, instructing, always wearing a suit, always kind of busy at work. Here's another one. This is him among peasant delegates of Congress. And so here's him kind of working within the government. Again, a man of change, a man of action, a man of duty, a man of sacrifice. These are some of the art principles that Stalin is imposing. So again, why? Why do we want to preserve this memory so badly? And here's again Lenin at the Second Congress of Soviet Workers, Soldiers and Peasants and Deputies. And so again, he's connecting that Lenin is a man of the people. He's always working to reform, working to do his best to advise and to change the Russian political and economic system. This one's a much more calmer image here. This is just Vladimir Lenin, Volny, sorry, in 1930. This is kind of an interesting representation because here we see him kind of at home, kind of in his intimate setting, and then we see the newspapers just kind of strewn here, and then we have the coverings for his furniture that's there. So to suggest that he's not there very often, His apartment is not decorated elaborately. He doesn't have, a lot of art on the walls. He lives very simply. Newspapers strewn on the coffee table here suggest that he is constantly up to date with the current events. He knows what's going on, and he's constantly thinking. He's a man of thought. He's a man of action. And so, again, as we think about why would he do this? Why is he representing Lenin in this way? Just a critical thought that I want you to kind of dig deeper and to think about what purpose would this serve, right? And mainly, as we think about this from a kind of a pushing past, it's kind of from a selfish perspective. And so what purpose, how would this benefit Stalin, right? I want you to then I want to take a look at some of how Stalin represents himself, which is quite different from Lenin. So another thing that I want you to think about is how does, Stalin represent Lenin and why? And why does Stalin represent himself, or at least want himself represented? So it's not him painting this, right? But want himself represented in this certain way. And so here we see Stalin kind of looking off, kind of stately. Generally, we're going to see him in a lot of military uniforms with medals and kind of decorated. And again, we see that the red backdrop here, the red backdrop of communism. Here's similar. This is a similar image that we've seen with Lenin before. But this one, he's out there instructing, he's out there teaching, and then you have the red backdrop behind him. But what's interesting about how he's represented himself, I don't know if he does this consciously or not. Every time he depicts Lenin, he's surrounded by a bunch of people. When he depicts himself, he generally tends to be kind of alone, right? Kind of distant, and that kind of produces this kind of alienated, this kind of stoic figure, almost untouchable. Like he is, he's teaching, he's instructing, similar to what we see with Lenin. But he's also kind of this man that, we can't necessarily approach or something like that. Here's another one that we do see him surrounded by people. It's a little bit different. The unforgettable meeting, where this woman gets to be lucky enough to meet with Stalin, and then she's surrounded by delegates. But again, he's represented in military uniform, constantly busy, kind of immersed in his politics and government and ruling. But then he does take time out for, the commoner every once in a while. And here's another representation that we see of Stalin. This one has, you have the Kremlin in the background after the rain. And so he's again kind of, this is a connection to him and his power, right? Anytime you see someone in a military uniform, we ascribe a certain level of power and authority, someone that we're not going to question. Has much more of an intimidating factor to it. So perhaps that's what he's representing, a part of the image that he's creating for himself. And then you have the government building in the background to connect what his power is associated with, right? And so kind of an interesting representation of himself. I want you to be able to think about how that's different from Lenin and how he's representing, how he's creating this cult of Lenin, and then how he's creating a cult of Stalin, and how these representations are very different in how he's kind of creating this message of himself versus the message of that he's creating for Lenin. So just some things to think about, right? I'm not going to necessarily answer that question for you. I want you to dig a little deeper, do a little bit more critical thinking on your own as you go back through these images and then think about what's going on here. The last thing I want to take a look at just briefly here is Soviet social realism. And this is a style that Stalin implemented as we think about the differences between art and propaganda. We've seen some propagandistic elements with the cult of Lenin. We see some propagandistic elements with the image that Stalin is creating for himself. Let's take a look at the art that comes out of the Soviet Union. Here we see the construction of the Dnipro hydroelectric station. What we're going to see with Soviet social realism are five main principles. Number one, it's going to be easy to understand. Number two, it's going to have to glorify the workers, the common people, right? So we see that we talked about the hammer and the sickle coming together. It has to be realistic rather than the suprematist abstract style of the past. Stalin implements more of a realistic, easy to understand type of art. It glorifies the workers, it promotes the government, and it rejects an individual style. This is not about, artists coming together to express their individuality. It's about them expressing the needs of the state. And so we see some kind of red flags starting to emerge already, or at least I'm hoping that you start seeing some red flags emerging as we think about whether this is art or propaganda. But here's kind of a message that Stalin declared about a 5-year plan. He says, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries." We talked about just kind of stopping there. We talked about before how Russia was kind of backwards as they entered into the 20th century. They were not industrialized, and they were not, didn't have a political revolution. Well, now they have the political revolution, and so the next step is to then industrialize, and they find that they are behind, the rest of the Western world, which is now heavily industrialized, and so Stalin, as a means of kind of national defense and national identity, he says that we must make good this distance in 10 years. We either do it or they will crush us. And so, again, we talked about logical fallacies before. I want you to think about what logical fallacy does that meet. Uh, but in addition to that, this is kind of the objective. This is what he's promoting, this do or die kind of mindset, and that we need to, modernize Russia. And so a lot of their art is going to focus on this industrialization, this modernization. And so the hydroelectric station here is bringing electricity to Russia, right? So this is bringing the modern world into this vast land, this vast region that is very much kind of rooted in the past. And so this is kind of a movement of forward, a movement towards progress. And we talked about how large Russia was, that it was 1/8 of the world's inhabitable or habitable landmass. So it's huge in terms of its space. And so they're going to have to do a lot of this. And so this is going to be mass, kind of on a mass scale. So we see similar ideas here with, I'm not going to embarrass myself by pronouncing the Russian names, but that this title is higher and higher. And so again, we have a similar image here that with the man and the woman working together in unison and what they're doing here. So again, this is celebrating the glorifying the workers. It's glorifying not just the workers, but also the government that's bringing this to pass, right, within Russia. It's easy to understand. It's hyper realistic. It focuses more on, industrializing and bringing this modernity to all of Russia. Similar ideas here, right? So we kind of just go through these relatively quickly. The first tractor, right? So it's not just industrializing with factories, but it's also modernizing on the farm. So we now have this, modernization of a tractor coming in, and it's kind of interesting that, I mean, this is 1937, and they're celebrating, the individual worker, and glorifying at the same time glorifying the country and Stalin, right, for bringing this modernity to Russia and kind of launching them into the 20th century. But 1937 is pretty late to have a tractor, right? So it's kind of interesting that they are far behind, but they're going to make up this distance pretty quickly and become, one of the largest powers within the world in a very short amount of time. Here's another one, the engine servicing. So again, focusing on communist principles, people working together, working in harmony. Everyone's kind of, in a collective effort. The emphasis here is on the train, which is bringing speed and travel and this progress to these far-reaching places, glorifying the workers, but also at the same time glorifying the government, which is, causing this to happen. And it all looks quite similar, right? There's not really a big difference between a lot of these styles. This is a similar idea here, the textile factory, glorifying workers and what they do in the common day-to-day. Similar things here. And then the election day of the Supreme Soviet. And so here, the kind of the message is, glorifying the government glorifying the common individuals, but also the focus on they have the right to vote, and so this is part of the political reform. And of course, in the Soviet Union, I think their vote was always 99% for the Soviet Party, whatever that was. And so, I mean, when you take a look at that statistically, most people say, well, that sounds like a rigged election, and for the most part, it was. And so, but the message here, right? So thinking about, the truth versus fiction. That's another part that we need to consider as we think about what is art and what is propaganda. And here's the standard bearer going to the far-reaching places of Russia, bringing this communist message, bringing these values, bringing modernity to them and then to the Virgin Lands. And so again, the far-reaching corners of Siberia, this message, these ideas, this modernization is coming together. And so again, I want you to think about, as Stalin's imposing this style, what makes this propagandistic, right? What specifically? I think if I showed some of these images to just the average person, they would take a look at this and just say, well, this just looks like art to me, right? It is, and I think a lot of people that don't really, know a whole lot about art would probably say this is great art, right? It's realistic, it's easy to understand, and we talked about, Brian Regan, that things should look realistic. I think most people would initially see this and say they would mistake it for art, but it does have some propagandistic qualities to it. And so what are those propagandistic qualities? How would you describe that? How would you explain that to another person is something I want you to consider as we think about what is art and what is propaganda. And so this is just one example as we take a look at Russia and the Russian Revolution and then its art, its artistic manifestations. I want you to think about this as a form of nationalism to kind of carry over our discussion of what nationalism is and this idea of bringing people together, this collective identity, and how art is part of that process, and how the political and economic changes are part of that process. But I also want you to think, apply this to our ongoing discussion of what is art and what is propaganda, and how this fits into that ongoing discussion as a representation of an actual society using actual artistic and propagandistic principles in order to create an effect, right? In order to create a vision of how they see themselves.